Helen Keller's image is on the Alabama State Quarter. It's an image taken from a photograph of her reading a Braille book. And there's a motto that says spirit of courage. In some sense, so, you have a woman reading a book, and that's understood to represent courage. And this is not to say that Helen Keller wasn't a courageous person, but it's kind of a safe message without any sort of controversial overtones to it. It's like Helen Keller worked hard and she got educated, and that's all we need to know.
Pretty much everyone learns about Helen Keller in school. From picture books to the movie The Miracle Worker, she is a staple in children's education. But we only learn about one aspect of a multifaceted and complicated person.
The dominant story about Helen Keller is not by Helen Keller. It's by sighted hearing people putting forth Helen Keller's story.
Haben Girma is a disability rights lawyer who is also deafblind. For Girma, getting Helen Keller's story right is personal.
The story focuses on her being 6-7 years old and things happening to her. People teaching her, people giving her water. She comes across as very passive, but if you learn about her life from her own words, you realize she was an agent of change. She advocated for women, people of color. Disability rights mattered to her. But the dominant story doesn't focus on that. Since society only frames her as a little girl, a lot of people subconsciously learn to infantilize disabled adults. That makes it difficult to get a job, to be treated with respect, to get good quality education and health care. That's not right.
Because we are so focused on Keller as a child, we often miss out on her long life of activism.
One of her passions was really the rights of workers and unionists. The progressive era, when she was working politically in different organizations, was a period of rapid industrialization. There were these new conditions in which workers were subjected to heightened inequality and even danger and risk physically. She pointed out that a lot of times people went blind from accidents on the shop floor. She saw this exploitation of employees by industrialists, factory owners, corporations. And so she became involved with the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. She read Marx. She corresponded with Eugene Debs, who was a major socialist at the time. And she helped co-found the ACLU, which we now sort of associate with freedom of speech. She had a spirit of wanting to help the collective good rather than individuals on their own.
She found the American Foundation for the Blind, which is an advocacy and education organization. She spent her life from 1925 onward as a spokesperson and as a fundraiser for that cause.
She was an early member of the NAACP. She condemns lynching. She condemns the racism perpetrated against African Americans. Many people like to think of them as opposed to racism today. It was not so typical to be opposed to racism in 1916 if you're a privileged white woman. It just wasn't. And she was.
People would often ask her, stop talking about racism and women's rights. Just talk about the blind and inspire us about the blind. She found that frustrating and continued to talk anyway.
When we talk about oppression and prejudice, disability is always sort of off to one side. But for Helen Keller, it was all of a piece.
You can't advocate for disability rights if you're not also advocating for racial justice and gender equality.
Critics of Helen Keller point to one notable exception in her advocacy for people with disabilities. She was once a supporter of eugenics, and now a reviled school of thought that sought to improve human populations by breeding out certain traits, like, for example, certain disabilities.
That's absolutely true. She did write about eugenics, and she was concerned that children with disabilities, who with severe disabilities, would not be able to function in society. I think it was part of that zeitgeist at the time. I think it's very easy to take history out of context. Very early on, she moved away from that position, and I think she would herself be heartbroken to think that she did not value every life, because she absolutely did.
People need time to grow and learn. We need to forgive people when they acknowledge they've made mistakes.
Still, Helen Keller's prominence is another reminder of how our American history often focuses on the stories of wealthy white people.
I don't have a perspective, on Helen Keller. She's just another, despite disabilities, privileged white person. I am a Black disabled lesbian who happens to be poor. You want to talk about intersectionalities and marginalizations. I'm looking up from the bottom. And I'm just out here trying to not only fight for the rights of all disabled, but wanting to highlight, even among disabled, there are those of us whose stories don't get told.
Anita Cameron herself was part of history in 1990 when she and several other activists from the disability rights group ADAPT crawled up the steps of the U.S. Capitol building to demand the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The law that now requires public buildings to have ramps and other accessibility features.
On a sunny, hot morning, we gathered up to do our crawl. That was the only way that we could get there, and we were trying to highlight the fact that people with disabilities, we live in second-class citizenship. Kind of went in stealth, started out as a tour, and when we got into the rotunda, we just took it over. When it all was said and done, 104 of us were arrested. I was number 81. I was in the center of a knot of people who had chained ourselves together. The combination of the crawl and the takeover of the rotunda is what got the ADA passed so quickly.
The fight for disability rights is far from over, but the ADA was a milestone achievement. It completely changed the way people with disabilities lived and recognized people with disabilities as people with civil rights. Helen Keller is certainly not the only disability rights champion we should be learning about. But learning about her work and her activism more fully is a step towards understanding the contributions so many other disabled Americans have made and continue to make to our shared history.
And she was born in 1880, and she died in 1968. It was a very long life.
That is beautiful.
So I think when we forget about the causes that she supported, it does damage to our understanding about disability.
Some people have a complicated relationship with Helen Keller because she's been forced on us as a role model to never complain, which is not true. She complained when it was the right thing to do. Because sometimes when things are wrong, you have to complain to create change.